Hello, everybody. I'm going to move this a little bit that way. All right. Hi. How are we doing? Yeah, doing the best we can. Let's try that again. How are we doing? We're doing the best we can. That's right. Woo! Okay, so it's great to be here, and I guess you probably saw my keynote remarks. This is a very different, thank you, this is a very different kind of talk, but it's related and similar to the stuff that I want to talk about. Specifically, I'm going to talk about more like production, less about production, more about design than I normally do, specifically because I feel that this crew is sensitive to and interested in design, and that's an important thing to be doing right now. And as a way of talking about that, I kind of wanted to let you know a little bit about me and where I come from. I've been sort of designing and developing games for 20-ish years or so. I went to my first E3 and my first Game Developers Conference in 2000, and this is apparently what I chose to commemorate from my first GDC. So these are just like the 9 photos I took with my shitty digital camera, and you can see that it was, you know, it was a certain kind of experience for me. When Chris Crawford founded the Game Developers Conference, which is our largest conference now, it was 27 developers in his living room, and you know, last year it was a lot more people than that. So games in particular, in the 20 years that I've been developing them, have really changed. It used to be a hobby that just like a bunch of dudes did, and then like there was Brenda Romero, like that's it. And now it's like a huge global community, and that's super exciting. This is what I looked like when I was in 2000, when I went to my first GDC. I was studying robotics and AI at the University of Chicago. And then this is me hosting the GDC Awards last year for the 2nd time. So, you know, again, things have really changed. And it's also why I'm really comfortable on stage, because I've been doing that with the crew that organized the show, actually. So it's fun, but it's also kind of amazing to me that I could go from basically being a programmer that literally no one knew to hosting this award show in that short period of time, right? I began studying computers and robots because I was interested in interaction design, and I was applying my research to things like the Sony Aibo. I was doing a lot of stuff with vision and sensing and search and rescue robots. But I was also really getting weirded out by what was becoming the robotics industry, and basically I didn't want to build drones. So I was like, well, maybe I'll do something else. I know, I'll make video games. They're harmless. You know, and so I wanted to learn about game design, but there were no textbooks about game design, and there were no schools for game design. It was not a thing that people did as like a out career. It was like, I'm a game designer, you know, like I've released a game. You can get it in the back of Walden books. So as a result of the research that I started doing, I started talking to other game designers and game developers, and I ended up kind of falling in with a group of motley crew of developers from MIT who were really interested in building systemic games. They built a game called System Shock and then another one called Thief, and I was really interested in their design philosophy, and I ended up kind of trying to codify it and working with a few of those people to develop this system called MDA, which is you know, it's relatively well known in our community. And that led me to teaching in a workshop about this philosophy. And, you know, I've been teaching that workshop now for 18 years in a row. So, like, we're still educating game developers in this philosophy 18 years later. So it's known, but it's like the community just keeps getting bigger and bigger, so you gotta keep spreading the good word. At the same time, I also started working on a curriculum for game development with those same developers, my friend Doug Church, Warren Spector, and then my friend Eric Zimmerman, who's at NYU Game Center, where Mittu is actually, to found this education subcommittee for what we call the International Game Developers Association. And we developed this curriculum and started promoting it with researchers and trying to get them to think about what it would be like to teach games to kids. This led to creating a summit, which was sponsored by Unreal last year. It's been also going, you know, for, what, 15 years. And in this conference, what happens is actual researchers who are PhDs and stuff and research They go and they meet from CMU, USC, and I've founded a program at UC Santa Cruz as well. I'm tenured there now, randomly. It's bizarre, but awesome. And these summits are a way for us to sort of talk about both the impacts of gaming and the language of games and the way that games communicate, as well as how we can work on them together with students and think about how education is influenced by them as well. This led to me participating in the indie games community, or the art games community, in a specific and particular way, and that I was starting to really think about at this time. This is like in 2001 or so, that there were just not a lot of games out there that were weird, and I wanted to make weird games. And so me and some friends of mine got together, and Intel gave us some computers, and we did this thing where we went into a room and we worked on games together. That's me trying to fix a bug, and in the back working with Austin Grossman, who actually works at Magic Leap, to kind of think about what games could be. The person that wrote the engine for this is Ottman Binstock, who is the principal research scientist at Oculus. So it was a lot of cool people in this room. They've gone all around the world. But I'm the first female game jammer on the planet Earth. Like, this had never happened before. And we did it. And then it just sort of was like, well, what should we do with these games? Well, we'll just put them on the internet and give them away for free, which was like a novel idea at the time. It became like a global phenomenon. I also started showing those games at Game Developers Conference and founded this experimental gameplay workshop thing, which is a showcase. We get about 250, 300 entries a year for 16 slots. So I'm trying to show you the most experimental games in my community so that I can inspire the designers in the audience to make even more weird shit. So it's like, you can kind of see where I come from, is that I come from this history of trying to see what's wrong and then like make a thing or break a thing so that then we can fix it, right? And it's usually make. I'm not a breaky kind of person generally, but don't test me. So one of the things that I realized a while back was that there were not enough of me standing on these stages talking. There were not enough women in games, and there were not enough people of color of games, there were not enough queer folks making games, there were not enough queer games, lots of stuff like that. And so I worked with several people, including the fantastic Megan Scavio, who I think she may be in the room. Yeah, there she is. Woo, woo. And my friend Angie Smets, who runs Guerrilla Games, and Siobhan Reddy, who's at Media Molecule, and basically is just a goddess. They're all really great. And we started, Carol Shaw as well, who's at Double Fine now. We started thinking about how can we create an event that helps not just like put people on stage, but prepare them to be on stage. And so this event, we give people free tickets to GDC, we fly them there, we put them up in a hotel, and then we give them a day of media training beforehand where they get to see themselves recorded and then speaking on stage, and get rid of the ums and the ahs that like kind of come up when you're a person who hasn't been represented and suddenly you have to represent for your community. That's like it's a hugely stressful thing. And so by doing this stuff, by working with the IGDA, like helping to form and then build the Global Game Jam, I have seen effectively games go from a place of like really seriously like just a few white guys in a room basically to like in the Global Game Jam there's like over 80 countries that participate all at once making video games and then releasing them, not just making games but specifically making games about a specific theme. So what you're getting is a global perspective on a theme like Ouroboros, you know, the snake that eats its own tail. What's a game about that? And then everybody makes it, and then they put them up online, and they have like a little contest, and we celebrate. It's super awesome. So I think the reason I wanted to put these remarks at the beginning is that it's a better time to be making video games, especially for women and people of color, queer folks, and people from all over the world that don't live in the US, Western Europe, or Japan. Like, it's a good time to make video games. And more students are trying to make games. So this is my program, which I designed. It has a terrible name because that's just what happens. I apologize. The major I founded there is the fastest growing undergraduate major in the arts on campus. And like, that's really amazing. It's a success disaster in that we have more students than our faculty can possibly handle. And I just hired actually A.M. Dark and Misha Cardenas, two women of color, to come in and be in the faculty. The tenure track faculty in my program is all female. Yeah, so I mean, like, you can do it. You know, it's possible. There's not a pipeline problem. So when I started in this industry, I thought about this a lot because there was a pipeline problem. In order to make the games that I started making when I first started at Electronic Arts, you needed to know someone who knew someone who knew someone to get your game pressed onto a disc and then put into a store. And it had to go through like these huge gauntlet, like of people being like, well, I don't know. I just don't know if this is going to fly off the shelves of GameStop. GameStop is like, we have a customer, and he looks like this, and he wears these sneakers, and he's going to buy this shooty thing, and he's not going to buy that weird thing about building with blocks. And then like Minecraft gets made, like what? So there was it was a different time. And now it's just not like that anymore. Like, this game, which is the last commercial console title that I released, Luna will become the most recent in December when it comes out for the PlayStation and PSVR. This game, it won all the awards in 2012. It was Game of the Year, won 7 of 9 BAFTAs it was nominated for. It was crazy, and it was an amazing ride to see so many people influenced by it. But what was so interesting about it is that games like Journey would never have been made if universities didn't teach games. The original founders were 2 graduates of a program from USC that my friend Tracy Fullerton founded. It could not have shipped if connected online consoles didn't have marketplaces for digital games and digital games distribution, which lowered the barrier to the kinds of games that are getting made like this. No matter how you look at it, Journey was the direct result of a movement which I feel has supported people in making experimental games and publishing them digitally, which is continuing to enable independent creators to do what they need to do to communicate and support their work and expression in the face of what could be increasingly controlled systems of production and distribution. So in a way, it's awesome, But I also had a really hard time at my last company hiring women, so I had to find my own company where I could do that, where the majority of us wouldn't be cis white male. And I think that that's really important. It's not the only thing about Funomena that I love, but it's something that I'm really proud of, is that we have an incredibly diverse team, and not just in terms of how people look or act, but where they come from and what their experiences are. We have scientists and people that come from just completely different media, voice acting, like, hey, I'm a writer and I'm a voice actor, come on board, We really love having lots of different perspectives at the company. And I could only have succeeded in building this business, which effectively is a research organization that builds AAA games that we want to build and then does research on emerging platforms, if the research on emerging platforms wasn't supported by an industry that feels that games are important. Like, Magic Leap feels that games are important. They are an important part of the ecosystem for this new hardware. And that in and of itself is power. Like, games used to be kind of looked at as a thing that some people did as a hobby, and now they are a reason that people buy new things. They are a powerful form of communication, but they are also promoting technologies, and that's like an incredible amount of power, right? Our games are beautiful and easy to play, and they're nominated for awards and winning awards all the time, and it's great. We love that, but they're also different. Like, they're extremely different. Like, if you ask someone who knows about games, about Keita Takahashi's work on Katamari Damacy or Nobi Nobi Boy, and then you see with Tom, they're just like, well, it's kind of like they had a baby. It's a really weird physics game, but it's all about friendship and the same kind of values that Katamari was about, which is that we all live on the same planet and we need to work together so that we don't all die. Underneath all of this are attempts to ask questions about human society and what the content that we make can do, right? So I've been thinking a lot about difficult problems lately. And as you may have noted in my keynote appearance earlier, this is something I'm really passionate about. I think that games can confront systems of representation and relationship and sort of undo ways that unconscious bias and nationalism create and support systems of oppression and war and violence in our society. I believe that they can actively portray the emotional labor and the tax that some systems of gender-biased thinking and exclusion place on women, queer folks, and trans folks in particular. They can also begin to test designs for whisper networks that are broader and more safe than the ones that we currently use to exist in our communities. I think that games can look at systems for voting and governance and communication and participation, and act as living brainstorms and simulations for new ways to think about these problems, even if they aren't explicitly political in their design. Like, a game can be about voting and not be about politics, if that makes sense. I think that games can help us think about finances and money and the way that these things are distributed. They can explore things like the way you would in a science fiction novel. What are we doing right now, and what might we do to more equitably and fairly distribute power, and money, locally and globally. Food waste and food sustainability, these are huge issues. They're all interesting topics for games. Like, they're interesting because they could potentially have a very strong impact on populations that don't necessarily understand how their individual choices in the systems where they are affect people in other places, and particularly their ability to have water and nourishment. Not all countries suffer from the rampant homelessness that we see in San Francisco or sometimes like here in LA. But we do need to consider things like pop-up housing and mass migrations in the wake of climate change. What other issues of the Anthropocene, which is the era of man on Earth, could we explore with our games? And how might we make them sketches of interactivity that would help politicians and researchers and scholars take action before it's too late? I think they're an incredibly persuasive medium when they're built a certain way. And I think that looking at these perspectives from games in the like old Walden Books kind of sense, or even the GameStop sense, is not really what I'm talking about. It's not going to solve the problems on its own, but it can help us imagine alternative futures to the ones that we are imagining right now, which are fucking scary. And scary to us, particularly as creatives, right? Because we're sensitive to the idea that these things are going to happen, and we're thinking about it almost all the time. I mean, if you're anything like me, you cannot really turn the news off. You know, so why do I think that you can make a difference, and why was I so passionate about that in the keynote? Is because I did. Like, I'm just one lady. Like, I'm just one person. I'm just one human being on the planet, and my work has concretely contributed to the distribution of games digitally that are creative, often made by students that are taught in programs at universities, right? Like, I have pushed for ways to support inclusion and diversity in our industry that have made concrete and measurable outcomes. Like, I told you earlier that I hired A.M. Dark to come teach in my program and be a tenure-track professor, which is amazing. It's amazing to have her be able to talk about representation and bring her perspective as an African-American woman to the program. But I met her at a diversity-related event that was inspired in many ways by the work that I was doing with Megan and everyone else. Like, it is a full circle, and we can do it. If games can change this quickly in 20 years, think about what this medium can do, because it's just getting started. Like, that's really amazing. This is a book that I read over the summer, and how many of you have read the Four Futures book? Okay. It's a good read. It assumes the four potential futures that would exist if we assume that automation and fabbing become widespread on the planet. And it looks at the continuums of scarcity and abundance and non-hierarchical and hierarchical rule. And effectively, it posits that there are four futures that are possible. One which explores the ideals of a society where things are abundant and people do as they please. You could kind of cross out the word communism here and say Star Trek. Then there's the climate change one, where it leads to such scarcity that we really need to work together to survive, which is a little bit, even that's not really like socialism that we've implemented on the planet, but it's getting there. Then there's a future where the very few people that own the IP that gets fabbed and control the automated jobs, basically the robots, they are the class that rules everyone else. And then there's one in which military force determines our population control directly and on purpose. And that is at the end of the book, which makes it a little bit of a downer. But as he posits, a great many more things might happen than actually do. And what struck me about this book is that if you explore future likelihoods, that's a really powerful thing to do, because even this book acknowledges, like, he's just guessing. Like, he's just kind of like, well, oh, here it is. Here's the theory. Like, I'm interested, but I don't really know. Like, none of us know. So specifically, he talks about this idea of assessing possibility rather than likelihood, because it puts our collective action at the center, while making confident predictions only really encourages passivity. And so, like, I didn't get up on stage and say, like, we're going to do it this way. I said we can do it, right? And it's up to us to imagine how we're going to do it. And so going beyond this, I think that the notion of simulating a future in your mind or in a game or in a book or in a story, you can create what could be thought of as a self-preventing prophecy, a tale that helps you avoid a specific future, or imagine alternatives to typical likelihoods that get discussed in our media. And that's really powerful. I believe that games can do this. In fact, I believe like games like Horizon Zero Dawn, which sort of posit a post-apocalyptic future with its matriarchal, where women lead, and like there's a real focus on the environment. Like that's trying to imagine in that space. It's an incredibly popular AAA game. That's really powerful stuff because it reaches a lot of people, young people especially. So I came here to visit with you as a colleague and talk about what I think is possible with respect to emerging platforms. And so having set up that space of possibility, both with my keynote and then these remarks, I want to talk about game design specifically for emerging platforms. If you're not a game designer, I apologize if this is a little bit much, but I really wanted to bring my best game design game to this room. So I want to talk about this thing that I'm calling a post-fidelity mindset, which I think is really important, especially as you saw in the keynote, like thinking about the different layers that people are going to interact with through devices like this. If you look at games like Horizon Zero Dawn, you can see that we really can do fidelity. Like you can play a game on your television set right now that has amazing depth of field and color correction, LOD management. It looks like a Pixar movie, right? It's awesome, and it's real time, which is amazing. People that make these games are geniuses. They're really at the forefront of graphics research, AI, lots of other stuff. It's awesome. It just takes a fucking really long time to get it done, and it takes a lot of money. Like a game like this is going to be $250 to $500 million, then it's going to have a similar marketing campaign, it's going to be $1 billion or $2 billion franchise over time if it earns out. Like, you know, these are big games. There are a lot of interesting technical problems to solve, and in graphics, like this is Dreams, which Siobhan is working on at Media Molecule right now. Amazing voxel-based renderer that they built there that's going to allow people to creatively build their own games in this platform, you know, on the PlayStation. Super, super great. But there are other things that are interesting to work on, and not just graphics. And if you look at basic AI, issues like pathfinding were finally solved, supposedly. And the stuff that I studied in graduate school, which was dynamic difficulty adjustment for games and level design, is now kind of a play in development teams, and that people build dynamic systems to help designers populate their world with plants, or like build little dialogue trees. Like we have dynamical tools that are helping us essentially save labor. And this is kind of where I make the point, like eventually maybe those become the robots that replace our jobs. So maybe don't support that research as much as you have been. I'm kidding. Or maybe I'm not. I don't know who I work for anymore. But I think it's important to think about this is like it is a problem that we're using to do certain things really cool. Alicia Leidecker, is she here right now? Are you here in the audience? No, she had to go off and wrangle people. She also works at Magic Leap. She helped organize this AI panel at the Game Developers Conference last year, which I think it helps illustrate some of the issues that we're facing. So I'm really interested in the idea of paying attention to other people, which you saw in the keynote today. Specifically reacting to things that I do that are unique to me as a player, not as they fulfill a contract between me and the game, i.e., in most games, I pass this shooting test, so then I get to loot the bodies and upgrade my gear, right? That's a fulfilling a contract kind of design. So my friend Laurelyn McAdams gave a really good example here. She's like, I love to play this game, which involves shooting stuff, and the monsters in the game are spiders. Sometimes, like maybe 1 in 6 or 1 in 8, you pull a spider, and she's fucking afraid of spiders. So she's normally a crack shot, but when the spider guy comes, she's like falling back and like she's flailing and not reloading, and like she's got a companion in the game that comes in and is like, "You got this." It's like, no, I don't actually have this. I find this really creepy. It's triggering to me. I want to play this game, but I fucking hate the spiders. Can I get through it? And like she was like, what if the thing noticed just basic stuff, like I'm not reloading? and realized that I was stressed out. Like, okay, well, with the controller, yeah, you know, you can do it. But with the headset, you know, you see it. Like, you're precognitive for these people, and it's interesting when you think about it, right? I also think that it's really interesting to show responsive emotions, which, again, you saw in the keynote, the first attempts at trying to do this. What I mean by that is that you're interesting, and specifically interesting to other people, not just the game designers that wrote the story. So when you look at literature or really good films, or like the comic books that we love, and even the games that we love, what you find out about interesting characters is that they're really broken. They're predictably broken. Not so predictably that they're boring, but like one of the hardest things about making other characters interesting is having like a subtlety of action that requires reading their intentions and planning on that and like having them have intent in a way that is formed by, for example, their general neurosis or their incredible ego. You know, like this is the kind of characters that we love. But when was the last time that you played a game where the characters were really trying to do this? This is a game called Facade, which my colleague at UC Santa Cruz, Michael Matias, made years ago with a comic book style, which is all focused on an engine trying to sort of recreate a Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf moment in an apartment at a dinner scene where you're the guest, this couple that is having real problems. It's awkward, but it looks like this because you can't do high-fidelity games and do this, or at least you couldn't before. And while this stuff is happening in the research sphere, I'm really curious about making it happen in our sphere, which I think is like, I mean, I am a researcher. I am in a university. I run a program. I have a research program. But I'm also a CEO and a designer and a game show host now. You know, and you can get these knives for free. But I'm really interested in like the middle of those two things, just like I'm interested in the middle of the spectrums of like, you know, handheld AR and like totally enclosing VR, right? So I'm a middle kind of person, and it's kind of, I guess that's just true. So when we look at fidelity, I think what we've achieved is spaces that feel natural with a pleasing density of action options or visuals which make you feel like the space isn't too thin. I'm not saying the space feels alive or real, it just isn't too thin. It's like this audience isn't too thin for me to feel like I'm giving a talk to an audience, right? If it was a little thinner, you know, I might be freaking out up here. But what we do is we want to give you enough to believe enough. And then there's the appropriate responses from characters, which are, you know, they're not always interesting. Like, you got this is not interesting. But like, you know, I can see that this guy's freaking you out. Let's retreat and reload. Is interesting. It's helpful because it's paying attention to me, and it's also supportive. It's like helping me live my best life while I murder spiders. So we do this thing called fidelity in games by simulating with physics and animation this pleasing density. We usually simulate with physics and supplement with animation where we have to. And then we script story beats and emotional responses, which often, unfortunately, sculpts player choice. How many of you played like a AAA shooter, like, say, The Last of Us? Or like, you know, I'm trying to think of something else. Like, yeah, just like Uncharted, you know, like these kinds of things, right? Like, if you play these games, what happens is you're moving through a space. The designers intend to focus on creating continuous, realistic world maps that require that you move through a space, and then they gate your choices for getting to different spaces by achieving different outcomes. So for example, if you don't shoot all these guys, you can't go into this room and get the loot, or the map, which leads you to the other guys where the other loot in the map is. And we're trying kind of to force an emotional moment in those little gates. And that's how games kind of take you on a ride. They're like, you did the thing. Okay, now we're going to calm down and tell you a story. Oh my God. And oh, hey, it's a romance. But no, there's a guy shooting you. Okay, that's how we do it. But what happens is that we run out of time because all of the other stuff that we're doing with the high fidelity development is so hard to do that we end up doing this. So the story is kind of like, it's a little not great. And it makes games, a lot of the narratives, honestly, they just come out kind of hollow because there isn't the time for the character development and there isn't the time for the narrative development. So it's actually like you're writing a novel and then you just randomly cut out chapters. The other thing that we do is we create a dynamic map that's linked where you can move from place to place relatively freely, but we create hot and cold areas on the map. So this map is really dense with aggro, like bad guys. And this part is like, it's a pool, and you can like come here and you can save your game, and you can reload and sleep, and then you'll recharge. And that also helps modulate intensity, but we give up so much authorship when we do this that it makes the game feel flat emotionally in a different way. And I have played a lot of video games, and this is one of the problems that bothers me the most, is that I love the high fidelity environment, and I just like, I do not care about the characters, or I couldn't care about the story arc, because it's either too short or it's too flat for these reasons. It's a design flaw. By contrast, if you look at dynamism, which you see in like a game like The Sims or The Spore, how many of you played Sims? Yeah, see what I'm talking about? You're my people. This is great. I'm so glad that I have to describe to you what Uncharted feels like. That's so awesome. When we try to push for dynamism, we end up creating spaces that are like living or changing. They're not living or changing because they're faking something real necessarily, but they're working to provide a representation to the player that has a pleasing density of choice or action or information. There's a lot of hidden information in these systems because the systems are doing a lot of stuff, and in order to figure out what they're doing, you've got to go poke at it. Your attention matters in a dynamic space, which is the thing that tickles your brain and makes you want to learn. Like when a kid, how many of you have children? Okay, when a kid takes the fork and then is like, boop, or the food, boop, or the diaper, whatever, and just drops it on the ground over and over and over, what they're doing is they're poking at something that has hidden information to them. And until they learn physics, it's like a miracle that the thing falls. And then when you put it back, they're like, oh, again, it's still doing that, right? This is what learning is for us. And it just unfortunately, we get to a place where we think we don't need to do it anymore, which is a whole other talk. But dynamic systems help. I think it's really safe to say that most of the high-fidelity games that actually have dynamism in them are doing it by faking it with putting other people in the space. Like, I made a game about two people connecting online and going to a place together, and most of the people thought that the other person, when they first played it, was an AI. We were totally cheating. It was just another person. But the person couldn't yell at you or say ASL or like any of that stuff. And so it felt to other people like it was a robot when it was actually just a person with a very, very high information filter on it. There was a lot of hidden information in that character. A game like Fortnite really does a great job of creating a sense of connection and dynamism and fiero and like interesting feelings and selling just billions of dollars of custom skins. But it does it by faking it with people. And the ones that I think are truly exceptional do this with systems. And I couldn't resist putting the slide in my deck because it's my characters that I designed for the Wii version of The Sims inside The Sims as minifigs, which I think is amazing. Like, that's me, like, what? In those games, like The Sims, or like my friend Jason made a game called 1 Hour, 1 Life, we see a simplification of the space, right? Graphically in terms of the way that the space works, and also in the way that it simulates physics. Like, The Sims don't really look like real people for the most part, and they don't act like real people. They're a representation, and it doesn't really try to hide it. But it focuses on the systems of action between the actors or the outcomes or the responses in a way that really helps you simulate an interesting space that's fun to poke at. And this is actually the opposite effect, effectively, on player choice from the systems that we were talking about earlier, because the state space of possibility in a dynamic system is so amazing. So instead of a game like this, you get games that look like this. And these are diagrams that Will Wright shared with me years ago. We can have like things like this, where a single choice can create a lot of other choices, or even better, where you move between decision points in the play space, and that has a direct influence on what's happening on the other side of that bridge, which I think is just fascinating. So this is where I am a little bit bummed. Experimental and systemic designs, like dynamic games, have a branding problem. Like high-fidelity games where you are the hero of the universe and everyone thinks you're amazing and you do everything great and you blow everything up and you get all the guns and you get all the ladies and you get all the cars and you get all the tanks and you get all the horses, whatever it is, they are really well branded and they are really well marketed and they look cool. It's like smoking. It's kind of hard to beat unless you actually campaign against it. And so the problem with dynamism is that we're like, hey, it's a science game. Awesome. Let's do it. Let's go to another planet. Come on, everybody, get in your spaceship. We're going to go see the guys with eyeballs, And it's just like, okay. Like, dynamic games could be really interesting about the stuff I was talking about earlier. They could be really cool. And there's a whole talk here, but I'm actually not going to give that either because I would just probably fucking swear the whole time. So we're just going to move on from that. But I do think that there's room to make games that emphasize player choice in a space of systems and not just on maps with hot and cool areas, while also exploring the relationships that happen between those types of players. And The Sims is still one of the best examples of why this is so popular. Like Ken Bai, who I just did a VR, Voices of VR interview with last week when I was at Oculus Connect. Like, my life is where it is going crazy. It was about a lot of this. Like, I think it's important to pay attention. And when you see this in titles like Fortnite, you know that it's important to pay attention. Like, it is possible to build a world in which someone is shooting but other people are dancing. you know? And that is an interesting thing to do, and people they kind of expect it now. So it's important for us to think about not just one player type for an experience, but all the player types and how they enrich each other's experiences. And you could use the word player type, or you could use the word user, right? That's like, if you're not making a video game, then don't make a video game, but still think about everybody and what their roles are. So these are some of the things that I'm really curious about right now. Collecting and observing information about a player or user in order to create a context that influences the behavior in the world, feedback, actions, and signposting, which then influence the behavior of the player, which enriches and enhances and shapes their experience. I always used to talk about the MDA framework, which effectively explains how mechanics, which are rules, create dynamics, which is the behavior of a system, which influence a game's aesthetics, which is the felt outcome in a player. But in my community now, this is so common as to be boring. The idea that you should start with aesthetics and move backwards to mechanics is becoming a key part of most game designs, especially indie games. Because we don't have time to test out a million mechanics and see if they actually lead to a feeling. We need to always be focused on the feeling so that when we develop, we're scoped correctly and we don't run out of fucking money before we publish. And so it's like we're really driven by the scarcity of means in our community to think about what is the reason we're building this, and like, why is anyone going to pay attention? I have this quote here, and I'm going to move my mic over so that I can read it. This is from The Art of Computer Game Design by Chris Crawford, which was written in 1984. Some media for representing reality are static. A painting or a sculpture depicts a snapshot of reality, frozen in time. Some media are dynamic. They show change with time. Movies, music, and dance are dynamic in this way. They are able to represent the changing aspect of reality more richly. But the most fascinating thing about reality is not that it is, or even that it changes, but how it changes. The intricate webwork of cause and effect by which all things are tied together. That's the learning stuff we were talking about earlier. The only way to properly represent this webwork is to allow the audience to explore its nooks and crannies and let them generate causes and observe effects. Thus, the highest and most complete form of representation is interactive representation. Games provide this interactive element, and it is a crucial factor in their appeal. Computer games seldom provide a human opponent, and so they lack the social element that other games can offer. No longer true, we're fucking cheating, we've been doing a really good job of it. Sorry, Chris. They can, however, present an illusionary personality against which the player must act or work. This is one of the most exciting and least developed potentials of the computer as a gaming technology. And regardless of the computer's success or failure in synthesizing a social element, or cheating with people, the computer can readily make the game a highly interactive experience for the player. It can react to the player's moves with speed and thoroughness. Well, we're not doing that. In my community, we are not actually doing this, but here, we're going to be doing it. And it doesn't have to be just games. Like, you could tell a story that is paying attention to the facial expression on the person that's listening to it and change the way that it's moving based on their reaction. If they start to tear up, you move further into that character, or not. So when you look at this through the MDA lens, I believe that what we're talking about here is enabling multiple dynamics, behaviors in a system, to emerge from a single set of mechanics while still relating to the overall aesthetic goal. And like the dynamics of poker, for example, include bluffing. Nowhere in the rules of poker does it say you should lie about what's in your hand. It just has hidden information. And there's money. And you're incentivized to want money. And you don't really like your friends. No, I'm kidding. But you don't want them to win because you're competitive, or it's just a game, or who knows, I just want the money. I'm gonna say I'm gonna double down. You can't read my face. Megan's really good at poker, so I'm not even gonna, she wins all the time. I have a terrible poker face. But the point is that the information in being hidden creates the behavior. You gotta think about this stuff when you're designing experiences for the Magic Leap. What are the behaviors that you are incentivizing with the information you expose and the information that you hide? When you look at a game like PUBG, which is a shooter which people play to be last man standing, much like Fortnite, People, when they're playing it competitively, especially do what's called rotations. So they get into clans, and then they move around on the map, and when the circle closes, which is basically making the island smaller, and everyone's trying to rush in and get it, they also rotate. They do this to avoid running into somebody and getting killed. Nowhere does it say to do this, but it's just a dynamic that is emergent. It's emergent from the mechanics of the game. And that's really cool. But like, I'm really interested in other kinds of dynamics. So I think that soap operas like Game of Thrones are really interesting because they're about sex and death. And I'm all about those things. Get at me. Shaping a world where choices have dramatic consequences, especially narrative consequences, and you don't necessarily have to deal with the impact directly. I mean, that's why we love them. Like, so much of the feel of Game of Thrones is the delicious predictability of a truly screwed up situation, right? Where you fantasize and you talk to other people about how it would play out. You even kind of think about how you would act in the situation, and then you wallow in the delicious lack of control and authority that you have over characters who just fuck themselves and everyone around them, right? Like, they just, literally and figuratively, it's just like, that's what it's about, you know? That's why it's popular. You know, a lot of that leans on systems of storytelling and into issues of history and lineage, where the joy is also in uncovering what happened and making decisions about what a future narrative or opportunity for these people would be. There are games that explore this. This is a game called Papers, Please, in which you simulate a border guard, and then there's drama that occurs as you pass or don't pass people across the border. You accept or don't accept bribes. It's a really amazing game. And I'm really interested in notions of social construction and government, nation states, territory and identity and othering that occurs in a nationalistic fashion, especially right now. And fresh perspectives on these would be really awesome. And they could happen, as we saw in the keynote today, in the form of web pages that explore a situation from multiple perspectives. It doesn't have to be a video game. I'm really interested in romance and falling in love. I've given a lot of talks as a game designer about how I wish there were more games that approached topics like romance and sex and intimacy more directly. And I'm really curious about how do we create connections between players or between players and characters in games or between people that are using an app that leverage this feeling of intimacy and connection while also letting them have some agency over who is in their space, right? Maybe some triumph and fiero. Maybe there's some competition there. Maybe there's some kind of a game there. Who's going to make the magic leap Tinder? That's a kind of interesting question, or a scary one. Even more interesting, how can we encourage players and communities to love one another more? Like, I think this thing really changes a lot of stuff. I think it's a phase shift. The idea that you need to wrap your player in a high fidelity world is completely evaporated now. Like, in the sense that you don't have to do simulating pleasing landscapes, density. You literally, if you do that, you're just going to confuse them because there's all this other stuff in their reality that they have to contend with. So it's now you're working with the player's world and you're captioning their reality, which is, you know, it's a lot of responsibility, but it's also an amazing concept to be able to be the person that's closed captioning someone else's reality. Like, Luna Moondust Kingdom is amazing. And like I said in the keynote, like, this is someone's living room. Like, this is the game being played on someone's coffee table, which they did clear off, it's true. But like, it's situated in the space because it has to be. Like, you don't have to build the whole world. Like, the VR version of Luna is gorgeous, and it wins awards for reasons. The artists that worked on it are super talented, and like, huge shout out to everyone at Funomena that works on the games that we make, because they're really good artists, designers, sound designers, producers, crafts people. Programmers. I'm going to think of who I'm going to, writers. Anyway. The reason that something like this works is because it's small enough, but it's pretty enough. It's juicy enough, right? And that is, when you're working on an emerging platform like this, you really can start over completely from scratch. You don't have to copy what the games industry did. In fact, if you do, you're going to die trying, because it's really, really hard to wrap the whole world. There's a really funny funny story that Pema Chodron talks about with Milarepa, who was a Buddhist monk, sort of saying, like, you know, it's like the world is a really painful and awful place, and so maybe you come up with this idea that you're just going to cover it with leather, so you don't have to feel it. Like, I don't want to feel the spikes anymore. Or you could just meditate and put some shoes on your feet. You know, literally that, like, mindfulness is the effect of wrapping your feet in leather. You don't have to change the whole world. You just need to put a little leather on your feet. So, you know, maybe what you're doing is you're putting a little bit of leather on the feet of the people that are putting the leap on, right? And, like, that's an immense amount of power. You're a small thing, maybe. You're a tiny little thing, but you have this huge amount of influence. Like, even if you're just popping up a little bit of information here and there, what you say and what you don't say is huge. You know, the absence of information is just as important as the presence of information, as we all know. So there are a lot of fresh places that games can go, and there are a lot of fresh places that applications can go, I think. And the power to explore them now is greater than ever. We've really come a long way as an industry in games, but even more importantly, I think in technology. Like, this is a really important moment. We've come a really far way, and it's your chance to take the lead here. On an emerging platform is more powerful than you could possibly know, for the reasons that, especially at the end of the keynote, when we're listening, you know, to the minds behind AT&T talking about, you know, the next generation of network and the thousands and thousands of % of growth. You know, if you're here now, you're shaping that, and that's really huge. To be the person that makes the really first, just like, amazing romance game on that platform, like, that might be better than a first kiss. I doubt it, but it might be worth trying to find out. I think it's really easy to complain. I see a lot of conferences. I do a lot of speaking. I go to events to raise money. I see a lot of people who stand up on the mic and say what we can't do. We can't do this, we can't do that, can't get the money, they don't want me, they're not inclusive, blah, 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 whatever, fine. Like, just do it. Like, generally, when you're on a stage and you're telling me what I can't do, I'm just going to get angry and try to figure out how we can do it. I mean, I have built a career doing that. That's why I'm here right now. Like, don't tell me that this ecosystem has to become toxic and filled with violent experiences that disenfranchise people and make people feel angry. Like, just don't. Like, don't tell me that. I don't want to hear it. But I really want to know is, what can we do right now to make it awesome and amazing? A lot more like Burning Man. As I said at the beginning of the talk, I think it's important to try new things. And trying them shows other people what might happen, right? Like, Funomena is, like, cruising along at our little altitude, 28 people, 6 years old, woo! We could catch fire and burn to the ground immediately next month if, like, someone cancels a project or I get hit by a bus, whatever. You know, okay, but the longer we're in the air, the more people will try. So, like, the weirder your shit is now, the weirder the stuff will be when you keep making stuff in this place. Like, the more experimental you are right now, the more innovation we'll see. And you're directly responsible for that, regardless of whether you make video games or not. I think that you have the power to encourage a specific kind of imagination in this world as we work through the financing and the building and the promoting and the celebrating stuff. We all collectively could be really changing the way that we think about this stuff. And I think games, in particular, have this amazing power to give people tools mentally to sketch, to play with, to imagine future realities that will perhaps help them deal with some really difficult and potentially overwhelming issues with fresh enthusiasm and drive. Like, I really believe that. That's why I still do it. Like, I don't make drones. I make video games. And video games are good for the planet, I think. What we make and how people interact with it is in no small way how the next generation of humans who are citizens on this planet, of the society of people on this planet, which is really one society now, will think. And I think that that's really incredibly powerful. You don't have to build games that are about the kinds of difficult things I'm talking about. You don't have to write experiences that try to address them, but you could. And from an artistic perspective, and perhaps even a political one, what I'm saying is that I think it's really important to ask the hard questions about fidelity and pushing back towards more dynamism, because worlds that assume that you're the king of everything and that everything is around you and then give you rewards for doing everything that it tells you to do is a bad trainer. It is not training you to collaborate with other humans and solve problems. It is training you to get your way right now, all the time. I want it my way all the time. What is that? Well, Pema would say that that's suffering. That's the definition of suffering, is being attached to having it your way all the time. And as a designer, I will note that if you really want to design something that you're going to have, you get to have 100% authorial control and you get to have it be the same way every time, don't design for a platform like this. You have to let go and give up control in order to design for emerging platforms. Otherwise, you will suffer. I believe that you all have what Roni and I have determined is a fresh head. We were saying the other day, like, what we need here is people who are fresh in the head. I love that phrase. I'm fresh in the head. You are open to creating new things and tending them and helping them grow for all the reasons that I've shared with you today, and I think that's really fantastic. So thanks for being here. Let's get it done. So that's it. There's no time for questions because we got started a little late because of lunch, but if I'm around and you see me, come poke me. Thanks.